This is The Naked Life with Roxanne Noor. Hello, Joachim. Thank you so much for coming here today and for speaking to me about the art of listening, which is something that you used in your past career. You were a composer and singer for classical music, and now you are a guide to help people relate deeper to themselves. You have a podcast called Relating to Self that I was just on. That's really a beautiful form of self inquiry. And you are a great listener and you hold space in a really beautiful way. And also, because you have this background in music, I would like to ask you what listening means to you, not only in your career of creating music, but then also the way listening has impacted your relationships in your life as a whole.
Hmm. Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's also a very broad question, right? Because listening for me is in everything. The act of listening is part of every single thing I do, whether it's trying to figure out how to do something in life, whether it's going through the world literally, like, going for a walk in the forest, whether it's sitting together with people I love or people I am getting to know, whether it's going through my own process of being human and intentionally changing my relationship with myself to improve my life. All of these aspects of my life involve listening in some kind of way. And of course, it's not always necessarily related to the ears or like the idea of sound. Um, but I think as an act, as a creative act almost, it's an essential part of everything I do.
Yeah, I would just reflect back that so much of being an artist, I think, is a state of being in this perceptive state of observation. And listening is fundamental to the way in which we allow life to touch us and how deeply. For you as a musician, how would you describe the various shades of listening? So you said there's a listening that happens beyond the ears. In music, what is the process like for you?
Hmm. Well, again, it has different kind of boxes there to unpack because there's a very different process I feel listening as a composer, like as a creative composer. There is an inner listening that happens. It's almost as if you open yourself to the experience of listening to what happens inside of your creative mind. And then as you listen to that inside of yourself, the music that you want to create takes shape. So that's one part of the listening experience. Another part of listening, obviously, is listening to a piece of music that's being performed, whether that's live or in a recording, doesn't matter so much. It's the act of being present to sounds that are happening and then interpreting those sounds in some way. And then there's a third aspect that I think is really important, which is the act of listening as a performer, which becomes kind of like, it's almost like a feedback mechanism between what you're doing and what's going on around you. And I think listening is definitely the most important skill of any performing musician. It's sure, technique's important and practice is important and tonality and mastery of the instrument and all that. But above all, I think what makes a good musician is the ability to listen to what's going on around you and to know what your place is within the whole. And to also, even above that, kind of also be able to listen to the larger experience of what is the audience going through right now, and what's the space like and what's the context like. all of these are different layers of the listening process that are crucial to a good performance.
Yeah. And when you say that, I really think of a lot of jazz music and improvisation in general is the act of being able to read each other and in that state create something that's collaborative. And I think a huge part of listening in general is that dialogue that's always happening. So whether it's the dialogue between you and the audience because you're reading the room, or it's the dialogue between you and the band because you're picking up on subtle cues. There's, yeah, exactly as you said, there's this presence, there's this attention, and creating like a sense of wholeness and completeness together through the act of listening. So you brought up the word presence. When you think about what listening really is in relationship to others, what are other qualities that come to mind for you?
Hmm. I think it's really all about presence and attention. Presence, as in not getting lost in your story about what's happening in any moment, but remaining with what is in the world, like really being present. It's like it comes back the word, but it's kind of unavoidable to all of the sensory input that you're getting, and not getting stuck maybe with one layer of interpretation, or not focusing too much on one thing, but having kind of like a broader, open kind of presence to what's happening. And then the attention part, I think, is crucial as well. It's this idea of directed attention. It's like, where is your attention currently resting? And learning to not only be aware of where your attention is, but to direct it very intentionally towards specific aspects. And I think that's what happens in a lot of great musicians, in great performers. They are able to project their attention on different things at the same time, right? So they can be attentive to, yes, my mastery of my instrument right now is important, so I can produce amazing sounds while also listening to what's happening around them, while also listening to the larger context of like maybe the audience and stuff like that. So this ability to direct attention in different layers and on different levels is also crucial. But so yeah, to bring it back, it's all about presence and the direction of attention.
Mm, beautifully said. Yeah. And yeah, when I think about different, yeah, producers and people who have helped people create really beautiful music. I feel like Rick Rubin is really one of these people, and yeah, he speaks to that, as you said, that there's multiple levels of listening and being able to give your attention to those various elements. And then he talks about how there's the essence of a song and how one of the most important things is being able to grab at that emotional space, the space that's between the words. And when I think about that, I think about even the fact of when someone's speaking to us and they say something. I feel like so much of listening is like being able to read between the lines, listening to the emotional body come up, the way the tonality, all the little things that actually words can't encompass.
Hmm.
Yeah, and being perceptive to that space.
Yeah, what comes up for me is a couple of things. Like, first, about what you said about Rick Rubin and this idea of the essence of a song, right? I think there is a danger in that as well, as in, I particularly always have liked music that wasn't forcing me to feel or experience a specific thing. There's a lot of music that is created with the goal, like specifically when you think about like film music is like the prime example. You know, this music will make you feel sad because there's a sad scene going on, something like that. And I've always loved music that doesn't have that kind of direct goal of making me feel in a specific way, and kind of just like makes a space available for me to experience some emotional states that may be interesting to me. And I think there's a beautiful co creation happening there between people who make music, whether it's composers or performers, and then people who perceive music. Like they can be part of that process of meaning making, because now we're talking about meaning, right? Like the essence is the meaning. And I've always preferred not to take people by the hand and tell them this is how you're going to feel now. So that's one thing. And I think the same thing goes for the second thing you said about like having conversations with people. I think it's really important to be aware of all the subtle clues of like, you know, the micro movements and what you call the emotional body. At the same time, I think it's really important to also resist telling ourselves stories about that and to stay with what actually is. And if a story comes up, we can then perhaps check in with the person like, hey, you know, I'm developing a story based on how I feel you here. What you're saying is this, but might also this be true based on your, I don't know, body language or something. And then checking in with that is an important process, because I've also noticed that some people think that they're really good at reading body language and emotion and so on, and then they end up with a completely different story that is very much their own projection, right? So I think this continuous process of not necessarily trusting your own sense making of what another is communicating, but always making it a dance and checking in again, and yeah, refining your understanding of the other as you go along.
Yeah, I think the most fundamental part of that, in order to not get lost in stories, is, yeah, if someone's saying something to you, but you're sensing the body language is kind of in opposition to what they're saying, or I don't know if you've had these conversations with people in a professional sense where it's really uptight because there's a lot at risk, or you're in business or whatever it is, and there's this kind of uptightness. Um, to me, also, the act of listening is knowing um, what how to create a real dialogue. And for me, that also includes curiosity. So asking questions. So instead of assuming, so I'm feeling that the energy is actually a little off and what they're saying isn't matching their body language, which is saying the complete opposite. There's like a gentle questioning or like an opening to allow the person to get to a state where they can actually say what it is they feel. And I think people are waiting for that a lot of the time. um, I've seen this a lot because I used to be in the world of technology of like, how are you doing? And you can tell someone's like really not doing well. And they're like, yeah, I'm fine. And, gently opening up the floor for meeting and humanness, essentially, and not being in these kind of mask like dances with one another. And so I think knowing what questions to ask is also a fundamental part in listening.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's this beautiful opening up that can happen when you yourself bring more authenticity to a conversation. I think this goes in many things, but like leading by example is one of my favorite ways to create change. So when I'm in that kind of conversation, I might even, instead of asking a question to the other person, I might kind of say something more vulnerable myself, or admit that maybe I'm not great in some way. And that very often already gives the other person permission to then also be more vulnerable. Um, yeah, and also I want to mention that I've also noticed that with a lot of people, in my experience, it's important to also still honor what they actually say, their words, regardless of the body language, the emotions, and so on. Because very often people will not be aware enough to catch themselves doing that. And the problem is that even though you see from their body language that they don't actually mean what they're saying, they will usually still act according to their own story. So what they say is probably true for them, even though you see that it might not be true for their body or something like that. And so I've seen this so many times also in like romantic relationships where people feel like, oh my God, this person clearly feels something for me or something, but he keeps denying it. And that's so annoying. And then I'm like, yeah, but the thing is that that person in their reality, the words signify something important because that's something they themselves believe in that moment. And they will not act from what apparently they're showing with their body, they will act from what they believe to be true about themselves. And so that's
Mm.
also an important perspective, I think, to bring to this. And that can actually be even like a meta listening of sorts, where you're listening to someone, you perceive their wholeness, but you kind of also listen to where they are at in their own story, and thus how will they act or how will they move from here depends on that understanding of their story as separate to their reality, so to speak.
Yeah, I think something important that you just touched upon too in the act of listening is also knowing how that person will receive something.
Mm.
To me, that's also fundamental in listening is like if this person is stuck in a certain story and I'm trying to bring them out of it, but they're not ready to come up for air or whatever it is, and I'm forcing a conversation or yeah, that is also an act of listening is what can this person handle right now? Where are they in their state of consciousness? How deep are they attached to a specific story and meeting them in a space? I feel like in myself, that's the hardest thing in the act of listening is sometimes I can be quite like rough and brutal in my language. And it's that knowing when to soften, knowing when to allow space. And I think that's also fundamental.
Yeah, I so agree with this. I think I would name this as meeting someone where they are. And that's a crucial act of listening. And what you say is very closely related to one of the ideas that at some point came up in my podcast from a philosopher whose name I sadly forgot. But it's something like we often think of authentic communication in terms of just putting something into the world. Like if I am very honest about what's true for me, I will just say it, right? That's authentic. But that's not actually true because the receiving part is missing. You can be as authentic as you want from yourself. If the other person doesn't hear you, doesn't hear what you're saying, then there is no authentic communication. And so his thesis then of this philosopher is something like the only true authentic communication that we can establish is always some kind of an improvisational state where we're constantly yes-anding each other's truth because you cannot deny the truth of the other, right? So it's just
Mm.
like, yes, I hear you, and you can add to something. And I thought that was a very beautiful kind of idea.
That is beautiful. And I also like this kind of when I think about, yeah, you brought up just philosophy and there's different schools of thought on listening. And I really like this Zen state of, and I think that's what we're all trying to get to at the end of the day in order to really listen, but the state of actually emptiness in a way, if we're actually really trying to understand the other. I feel like there, at certain points, needs to be a necessary emptiness in order to not make the whole conversation a who's right or who's wrong, to let go of righteousness. I feel like to listen, there is this state of sometimes being empty. And I think this is confusing in states where we need the most listening. Something that comes up for me is the realm of politics and how it seems that everyone thinks that listening is agreeing, so they're constantly cutting each other off. If you look at any political debate in the United States, it's like there is zero, like absolutely just zero listening. And it's like, oh, if I listen, then it means I agree. So I'm just going to cut you off every second and speak. And in that way, there's very little understanding or reconciliation. And it's yeah, it's very much the opposite of listening.
Yeah. There is this state that I would describe as something like a loving presence, where the only thing you do is truly just to be present to another in whatever they are expressing. And that's a state for me where maybe all judgment is suspended. there is no need to interpret or to judge anything, and just being there. And from that state, I think something really important can happen. And that is so far from the realm of what you just mentioned about like politics and how people talk in politics. I usually think when I see political debates of some kind, I'm like, these people already know what they're going to say, regardless of what the other person is saying. So they're just both trying to get their point across in some way, without either of them thinking that in order to get a point across, the other person needs to be open and listen. So I should also do that, because otherwise it won't work. That's somehow too complicated for these people. So yeah, it's a difficult problem, and I think we underestimate how difficult listening actually has become. Or I can't say has become because I have nothing to compare it to, but I think listening is not a given. Like, people are not born with the skill to listen. I think the skill to listen is something that needs to be trained. It's a practice. And I have trained that skill through my education as a musician, obviously, because you sit through so many concerts and there's so much listening involved that you learn to hone that ability to tune into different things, to pay attention to different things. It's a lot like meditation. Like, when I started my meditation practice, there's a lot of parallels there between just a meditative state and a state of truly being present to either music or to what someone is saying.
Mm. Yeah. And if we could describe in a way what meditation is, in the beginning of the way I learned a lot of meditation is in the beginning, it's actually about focus. So it's about focus on what the present moment is containing. And that is exactly like watching a symphony or going to the Philharmonic. When I can be in a state of complete presence there, it's like everything starts to expand and I feel more. And so much of the way we relate to music is always in the background. I'm listening to music while I'm cooking. I'm listening to music while I'm driving. I'm listening to music at the bar while talking to five other people. And to be in a state of, yeah, going to the Philharmonic or a symphony or an orchestra and just sitting and just being in that state of focus and presence, everything expands and you start to feel so much more. And it's so obvious, but yeah, I feel like I love these states um, where you're just going to listen. I had a boss who he had this one room in his house, and on every side of it, he was a billionaire. So he was crazy, crazy rich, and he invested in huge speakers. Every wall was a huge speaker, and he had a throne in the middle of the room. And he would close the lights and sit on his throne and just blast music. And sat on that throne once and did it and did it for like 10 or 20 minutes. And it was just exactly what you said. It was a meditative experience, like to just really listen and to feel, um, yeah, to feel music, to feel vibration, which is so healing. It's such a beautiful thing.
Yeah, I think there's something also really important about the fact that a lot of the music that is omnipresent, as you said, right, there's music everywhere now. A lot of that music has been specifically designed to not need that. So the kind of music that usually is played in these kind of environments, like bars, hotels, restaurants, whatever, is the kind of music that you don't need to pay attention to. It's kind of just there. And usually it's because it's very, very similar to music we already know. And that's kind of like how the pop music industry works. They keep making things that are just slightly different from what you already know. So immediately you have a feeling of like, oh, this is familiar. This feels nice. I can kind of tap my foot with this. I already know how this is going. This is predictable in other ways, right? And I think there's something really important that happens when the music you listen to becomes unpredictable. For many people, that becomes very jarring, right? It's because they're so used to be able to predict what's going to happen and feel comfortable with that, that when they are exposed to music that is not predictable, they kind of freak out, or they even don't think it's music anymore. But I think that's when those kind of meditative states can happen much more easily, because you're obliged to truly be present in every moment to just what is actually happening with the sounds, because you can't predict it. Your brain is constantly just like, wait, I'm trying to predict it, but I can't, so I'm just going to let go. And then it's like the ultimate form of like non-attachment. You can't be attached to whatever is going to happen. You just have to listen to what is right now, and it might change at any moment. And I think that's also why I have developed this capacity, because I have studied music composition, towards the end of the 20th century. Um, there's so much music that is not anymore about being recognizable or being pleasant to the ear. There's so much music that just sounds very strange for most people who don't have experience with that. And then I think that has really allowed me to go deep in those states of meditative presence and having to let go of expectations. And I think that's another thing that's underestimated about music, that we can truly learn to appreciate something that doesn't feel familiar or good at first.
Yeah, and I think one of the perfect examples of this that you brought up, when the audience feels jarred or it's not what they expected, and it could actually be a psychedelic experience in a way, or just something that's so profoundly different. But because it's so jarring, the um, response is more on the negative side. I feel like the perfect example of that was John Cage 433, where he did not play any music in the room for those 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And everyone was just in a state of confusion. And he wanted it to be actually about, what is the ambient sound right now? What are the people who are supposed to be listening are actually the ones creating the sound, and to look at that soundscape. And he really used it in a philosophical lens too, like the sound of silence. There is never complete silence. Like I could not be playing, but still there's those little taps of the foot. There's, yeah, what's going on in the room. And it was so interesting how this piece is so revelatory, and for some people also like really disturbing, because it was not what they expected at all. You go into a state like that and you're expecting to be played too, not to sit in silence and hear ambient sounds of the room. So that in itself, yeah, I feel like a lot of ambient music, avant-garde, there's so much way in which we can experiment, but it's not always going to be received in a positive note.
Yeah, and maybe that doesn't matter so much. I think John Cage couldn't care less whether people, liked that particular experience. I think the more important point that he was trying to get across is something like, the difference between sound and music is the act of listening to something as music. And so whatever it is, whatever sounds are present in the room, you can listen to as music if you just close your eyes. And interestingly, well, I've done a lot of work around that, but it becomes more obvious in a recorded situation than in a live situation. Because live situations happen all the time, right? People sit in an environment, there's all kinds of sounds that could be music if they only listened to it in that way. But people don't. But when you record that sound and then you give people headphones with, like, I don't know, office sounds or something, and then people sit and listen to that recording of office sounds, there's a higher chance for them to perceive that as musical than when they're actually in it, which is interesting in itself. But yeah, I mean, what you said about silence also, I think, is an important point. Silence doesn't exist, right? The simple act of being a listener is noise. And John Cage actually did that experiment. He went to the most silent place on Earth, which is inside of a laboratory where they do sound test recordings and stuff. And when he was in the most silent place on Earth, he heard two sounds, a low one and a high one. And then he inquired to the people working there, like, what's up with that? I heard two sounds. Is the room malfunctioning? And they were like, no, the two sounds are the sound of your blood circulation, and the sound of your nervous system. And so you can't not hear those sounds, otherwise you'd be dead. So there's that. And then the other thing about silence not existing, for me, that's kind of like a philosophical point that I'm trying to make sometimes, is that silence is not so much something that happens around you. Silence is something that happens in you. For me, silence is the state that I achieve when I do not feel the need to add to what is already happening. And that can be a very peaceful kind of experience, even when there's a lot of noise around. That's the paradox there. You can sit in a very noisy environment and find that silence. And that for me is, well, I guess that has also saved my life at times in terms of like being able to deal better with noisy environments. But yeah, it becomes like a state of non-doing.
It's also so interesting the way silence is interpreted in conversation. And so I feel that there's some moments I've been in where it's silent because nobody has anything to say to each other and there's an awkward tension. And then someone's trying to fill the space and starts talking and it's not really doing anything. And then there's this other state of silence, which is when the moment so seizes you that there's just nothing to say. And you're just all sitting there in a wordless awe, and everything just feels vibrant. And you know that putting words on it would dilute the experience. And so it's so interesting the way both are silence. It's silent in the room. And the connotation on why can be so vastly different. And the way in which we all relate to silence as either something that needs to be filled or something that's just like coming out of a fullness because there's nothing more to add, exactly as you said, and how those are two very different ways of relating to life.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's also a good heuristic for understanding how people navigate life, right? People who are able to sit in silence, both with themselves and with others, usually have more awareness and are able to bring more of their authenticity to the world than people who just cannot be in silence and have the need to then feel the silence. I think it's a question of like inner security, a sense of inner well-being or inner peace that you can just sit with. And yeah, not too many people seem to have that.
Yeah. It's also, I think, a huge so much is just the fact that everything is becoming noisier with the amount of information we're being fed all the time. And so, even if there's not so much external noise, even if you're in the deep country, but you take out your phone, it's just like you're bombarded with messages and it creates so much internal noise. And so, I think silence is so, I mean, silence, we said, silence is so necessary to reconnect to and come back to. And I think it goes back to that Zen notion again of emptiness, of like, how much can I let go of so I can actually allow this moment in front of me to fill me rather than holding on to five other things that aren't right now. And so, yeah, it's this really yeah, a really beautiful dance of emptiness being allowed to fill you, then emptying again. And I think that's a lot of what presence is and listening.
Yeah, and also I would add that takes a lot of time, right? Once you're filled, and in our most of our current Western societies, we're filled to the brim all the time, right? There's just so much going on. And then I've noticed that when I first removed myself from those kind of circumstances and went to more quiet places, quiet both physically and metaphorically, I just needed a lot of time to have my subconscious unfold all the stuff that was still in there. There's so much going on in the beginning. And so it takes a while to kind of like come to a place where you can actually experience the state that you are referring to. And I think for a lot of people, that's also problematic. And it's a question of privilege. Like, few people have the privilege to sit in quiet or silent spaces long enough for that process to happen. Like, at best, people have busy lives, people are super full, and they're like, yeah, I'm going to a 3-day meditation retreat, and then, I'm gonna like, feel so much better. But to be honest, 3 days is nothing when it comes to just like emptying the mind of what is already there. That takes so much longer in my experience. And yeah, so sadly, many people never have that experience of sitting in silence or sitting without filling for long enough to let that process completely unfold, to then experience this state of emptiness.
Mm. Yeah, you're completely right. And even when I think about what privilege looks like to me, a huge part of it is actually space. And space which gives privacy, and the privacy which gives solitude, and the solitude which gives silence. And I remember just, yeah, when I visit my family in Mumbai in India, it's like 7 people living in a one-bedroom apartment, and you never get a single moment of being alone. And so how can you be in that state of emptiness or silence, or even a state of thinking only about your own life because you're always being confronted with everyone else's dynamics. And so it is such a privilege to just even have a room of your own in life and to be able at the end of the day to unwind, to sit on your bed and meditate for even 20 minutes. It is a huge privilege. So, yeah. Um, this conversation has been super beautiful, and I'm wondering if there's anything that comes up for you that you would like to add when you think about that listening or silence or music?
Hmm. Yeah, thank you, Roxanne. I think one thing I would like to add is the perspective of relating to self. So I believe that there's only one relationship that we are always in, and that's the relationship with ourselves, which makes that the most important relationship we will ever have, according to me. And there is something really important about listening that has to do with my experience of how I relate to myself. Because for a very long time, I think I was really good at listening to others and to the outside world, which is also my training as a musician, obviously plays into that. But then there's this discovery of like, wait, but I have to listen to myself as well. And that take different kinds of forms. It's listening to your body. It's listening to what's happening in your body, like starting to be aware of that, starting to feel the processes that take place in your body. Then it's listening to your mind, to like all the parts of your mind, all these different kind of voices that try to tell you things to keep you safe, to protect you from stuff that isn't necessarily relevant anymore. But like listening to those voices. Then there's the listening to your emotions, right? There's listening to like what emotional states actually come up and how they evolve over time and what happens to them. And then there's the whole idea of like listening to what I would call the higher self or something like that, like the the part of you that perceives all the other parts and that maybe through training is able to then be in the driver's seat of her life and live like an intentional kind of life. But even there's so much listening involved to like, what is it that I actually want? And that's an experience I've had, well, quite recently actually, that kind of shook me and took me a while to process. And I'm still in that process, I would say, which is that after being a musician, I created a company with a friend. So then I was like acting as CEO of this company. I stepped away from that role last year. And then for the first time in my life, there were no more external obligations. Nobody expected anything of me. There was nothing that I needed to show up for or attend to. Everything that I did was purely out of my desire and intention and that was so strange in the beginning. And I realized it was because I had not perfected the art of listening to what I actually want. Because our daily lives, our normal lives, are so full of things that we have to do, that we have to show up for, other people's expectations, things we've committed to, agreements we have, and so on. And so we keep doing that. And then when that all of that disappears, then suddenly we're only left with, I can now listen to what I actually want. And it took me a long time, a surprisingly long time, to be able to tune into that more. So that's an act of like inner listening that I would say also is supremely important, but that nobody ever talks about. Well, very rarely I've heard anyone say anything about that. I'm practicing listening to deep in myself what wants to emerge. So yeah, that's something that I feel we haven't touched upon yet that I felt was meaningful to this conversation.
Yeah, and I think you're correct in that probably I would agree with you that the most important relationship is the relationship to self. It creates all other relationships. And this inner listening, it's for me as well such a process because I'm in this body that's changing every day. And the demands that are coming up are, if I'm being honest with myself, inconsistent. And I think it was Gandhi who said, I follow truth over consistency. Because the fact is, what I wanted even a month ago, I don't necessarily want right now. And yeah, it's this like really like attunement to what's going on. And instead of just only staying in this rigid state of like, this is what I should do because I say I'm a writer, so I should do this, or I say I'm blah based on my role in life, but like this inner listening that's like, sometimes in conflict with what you said before. And for me, this is also an act of listening and also weighing the scales and knowing what I really want, not just right now, but in this long term vision of life as a whole. And so there are so many aspects of listening. There's so many aspects of self and knowing which parts of the self to give more weight to sometimes, and maybe which parts of the self it's like, okay, I see you and I hear you, but right now we're not doing that. So it's this like constant dialogue going on inside. And it's confusing sometimes. Yeah. And it takes such a conscious awareness to even listen to the state of the body, to really come back to the body, like you were saying, and to navigate all the little cues, all the little things. And I feel like when I'm in those states, it's very helpful, because also I never will okay, I don't wanna use the word never, but actually rarely, when I'm very attuned to my body, I don't get sick. So, I'm catching all the small things, and because I can see them, I can work with them immediately before I catch a cold or whatever it is. Yeah, I can feel when my immune system is lowering. I can feel my emotional response to someone based on the feeling in my stomach. There's like so many cues the body is giving us all the time. And so, this state of inner listening that you brought up is incredibly important.
Yeah, I agree.
Oh, so I'm super, yeah, I'm happy for our conversation. I'm happy with the way we met and um, yeah, the way I met you in Berlin, of us not knowing each other and me getting to interview you for the documentary about freedom and to just sit and listen to you because yeah, you're a very profound person and someone that I am, yeah, grateful to get to know, and it's been a pleasure to speak to you and to listen. So thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Likewise, I very much enjoyed our first meeting and the way you held space for me to express myself in that documentary, and then our subsequent conversations. And yeah, um, this is lovely. Thank you so much.
Mm, thank you.